French Revolution caused political conflicts, rebellions, and famine to sweep across the nation for almost 10 years. As peasants revolted and monarchs gained power, the French Revolution affected many people's lives through disaster, destruction, and death. Rights were lost for some and rights were gained for some. It all depended on political power and economic difficulties throughout the nation of France. As the battle disasters quickly inflamed, revolutionaries thought the king was in league with enemies. January 21st, 1793, when a crowd of Parisians stormed the royal palace of Tuileries and slaughtered the king's guards, the royal family fled the legislative assembly, escaping before the mob got too close. Citizens attacked other prisons that held nobles and priests accused of political offenses. Some called the citizens bloodthirsty mobs who carried out the massacres. When the radicals took control and called for the election of the new legislative body called the National Convention, suffrage, or the right to vote, was extended to all male citizens, not just property owners. The convention voted to abolish the monarchy and establish the French Republic. Another thing the convention did was put King Louis XIV on trial as a traitor to France after being convicted by a single vote and sentenced to death. The day of his excommunication, Louis mounted on a scaffold in a public square and started a speech. King Louis XIV began by saying, "Frenchmen, I die innocent. I pardon the authors of my death. I pray God that the blood about to be shed will never fall upon the head of France." Moments later, the king was beheaded. By saying this quote, Louis meant that he hopes his mistakes don't negatively affect France in their future. After the execution of King Louis XIV, France was still being threatened by Britain, the Netherlands, Spain, and Prussia, and in Paris, the sans-culottes were still suffering from the food shortages and inflammation. To deal with the suffrage, the convention created the Committee of Public Safety. The committee prepared France for all-out war by taxing all citizens to contribute to war effort. Robespierre, a lawyer and politician, rose up to the Committee of Public Safety, where he earned the nickname Incorruptible for being so selfless towards the revolution. Robespierre embraced Rousseau's idea of the general will as the source of all legitimate law. He also promoted religious toleration and wanted to abolish slavery. He was very popular with the sans-culottes, who hated the old regime as much as he did. He believed that France could achieve a republic of virtue only through the use of terror, or, in his words, prompt, severe, or inflexible justice. He stated that liberty cannot be secured unless criminals lose their heads. Spectators greeted death sentences and cries of "Hail of the Republic" or "Death to the traitors." Robespierre was also the chief architect of the Reign of Terror, which he thought was the key to achieve the goals of the revolution. Those who resisted the revolution were either executed or arrested. Within a year, terror consumed those who initiated it. People turned to the Committee of Public Safety as their only hope. The next day, Robespierre and other radicals fell, and all executions started slowing down dramatically. Like I said before, Robespierre explained that it is necessary to achieve goals of the revolution only through terror because it is necessary to stifle the domestic and foreign enemies of the Republic or perish with them. Robespierre stated, "Suspects, or the people who resisted the revolution, were arrested during the Reign of Terror. 17,000 people were executed. Many were victims of mistaken identity or were falsely accused by their neighbors. Many were packed into hideous prisons where deaths and disease were very common. A famous sign of horror was the guillotine, which was a fast-falling blade that extinguished life instantly. Many people were killed, but when the king's head fell, the number of executions degraded." On top of all this chaos, women were getting upset that all these rights were being granted for men and not women. This sparked Olympe de Gouges to demand equal rights in her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. This document said that all women are born free and her rights are the same of those as man. Many women, including her, were faced with consequences for voicing their opinions in public by either imprisonment or execution. On October 5th, more than 6,000 women marched from Paris to Versailles in the pouring rain. They were marching for bread and demanded to see the king. Many of the women's anger was towards Marie Antoinette and the extravagant life she lived. They felt that her life was filled with great pleasure and her life overshadowed everyone else's. The women refused to leave the march until the king agreed to return to Paris. When the king was leaving, the women perched on the barrels of seized cannons and told everyone that they were the reason for King Louis XIV's and Marie Antoinette's departure. After the women marched in Versailles, the National Assembly followed the king to Paris. Marie Antoinette and the rest of the royal family had been urging the king to escape their humiliating situation, and finally, Louis gave in. One night, a coach rolled towards the border, and inside sat the king himself, disguised as a servant, and the queen dressed as a governess, and the royal children in the back. But unfortunately, Louis' disguise was uncovered by someone who recognized him from a piece of currency with his face on it. Soldiers escorted them back to Paris as insulted the king and the royal family. Many people viewed Louis's planned escape as an act of traitor to the revolution. When the common people were fed up with the royal family, more than 800 partisans gathered outside the Bastille because of the belief that weapons and gunpowder were stored in there. The crowd demanded for the ammunition and weren't going down without a fight. The commander of the Bastille refused to open the doors to the people where they were fighting for their lives to get in. Finally, the enraged crowd came crashing in, where they released a handful of prisoners and executed the commander and a couple of guards, but found no weapons. This battle is viewed as a symbol to the French people, representing years of abuse by the monarchy. To this day, the French celebrate this day as their National Independence Day. In response to the storming of the Bastille, the revolution began its third stage of reformation. Moderns produced a constitution to try to start moving away from excesses of the convention. The Constitution of 1795 set up a 5-man directory and a 2-house legislature elected by male citizens of property. The rich and the professionals of the middle class were the dominant force at this stage of the French Revolution. Weak but with total power, the directory faces growing discontent. As the war with Austria and Great Britain pursued, peace was made with Prussia and Spain. When rising bread prices and food shortages struck the economy and riots were starting to form, the directory quickly suppressed them. Another threat to the directory was the revival of the royalist feeling. Many nobles and clergy who had fled France were getting welcomed back by the devout Catholics. As the financial crisis deepened, King Louis XIV told Jacques Necker as a financial advisor to help him guide him and give him advice. When Necker suggested that they start taxing the first and second estates, the nobles and the high clergy demanded that the king dismisses him. As more and more pressure builds of reformation, the wealthy and powerful class demanded that the king summons the Estates General before they make any changes. This was a big deal for the king, considering that the last French king called the Estates General over 175 years ago. And Louis was worried that the nobles would use it to recover the feudal powers they had lost under absolute rule. Louis XIV summoned the Estates General to meet at Versailles the following year. The Third Estate wanted to go to Versailles not only to solve the financial crisis, but to demand the Reformation. To prepare for the meeting, Louis asked for all 3 estates to make a list of their grievances, otherwise known as cahiers. Many people use cahiers to express their wants as far as getting paid and wanting the prices of things they need to live off of cheaper. Another issue at Versailles was voting. No matter what the circumstance, the Third Estate was always getting overruled by the First Estate. Eventually turning to the tennis court oath, where the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly as self-trusting. As the financial crisis deepened, King Louis XIV chose Jacques Necker as a financial advisor to help guide him and give him advice. When Necker suggested that they started taxing the First and Second Estates, the noble and the high clergy demanded that the king dismisses him. As more and more pressure builds of reformation, the wealthy and powerful class demanded that the king summons the Estates General before they make any changes. This was a big deal for the king, considering that the last French king called the Estates General over 175 years ago, and Louis was worried that the nobles would use it to recover the feudal powers they had lost under absolute rule. King Louis XIV summoned the Estates General to meet at Versailles the following year. The Third Estate wanted to go to Versailles not only to solve the financial crisis, but demand reformation. To prepare for the meeting, Louis asked all 3 estates to list their grievances, otherwise known as cahiers. Many people use cahiers to express their wants as far as getting paid more or wanting the prices of things that they needed to live off cheaper. Another issue at Versailles was voting. No matter what the circumstance, the Third Estate was always getting overruled by the First and Second Estate. This eventually turned into the tennis court oath, where the Third Estate declared themselves as the National Assembly and established the Constitution. From the start, voting has always been a challenge for the Third Estate. The Third Estate has always been overruled or overpowered by the First and Second Estate, simply because they are more powerful. Traditionally, each state voted separately, with each group having 1 vote. But just because the Third Estate technically has a voice, and the First and Second Estate always outvoted the Third 2-1, this time the Third Estate wanted all 3 estates to meet in one single body with votes counted by head, since the Third Estate consisted of 98% of the population. In 1789, the Third Estate claimed themselves as the National Assembly, representing the people of France. A few days later, the National Assembly found their meeting hall guarded and blocked off. They then moved to their meeting to a nearby tennis court, where they took the tennis court oath, vowing to create their own constitution. As a first step towards writing a constitution, the National Assembly issued the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789. This document was inspired and written in model of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen declares that all men were born and remain free and equal in rights. Also, this included the rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The Constitution also insists that the governments are here to protect the natural rights of citizens, not take them away. Since the Declaration proclaimed that all male citizens were equal before the law, this means that every Frenchman had an equal right to hold public office, quote-unquote, with no distraction other than that of their virtues and talents. Another thing that the Declaration asserted was freedom of religion, along with lowering taxes according to ability to pay. Even though this document may seem like it has a lot to offer, it only applies to men. Women were disappointed that the Declaration of Rights of Man did not grant women any rights. In 1799, Napoleon helped overthrow the weak Directory and set up a three-man governing board known as the Consulate. He had called himself the first consul before he was forced to move to Spain and return to Louisiana Territory to France. After this action, he had named himself consul for life. 2 years later, he thought he had enough power to change his name once again to the Emperor of French. To celebrate his successes, he had a coronation in which he invited the Pope to preside. During the ceremony, however, Napoleon took the crown straight out of the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. This action shows that Napoleon owed his throne to no one but himself. As Napoleon was rising in power, he held a plebiscite, or a popular vote by ballot. Even though the people theoretically had a say in government through their votes, Napoleon still had absolute power. When Napoleon strikes Britain, he goes for the throat. The one thing that Britain depends on most is its commerce. Napoleon began by waging its economic warfare through the continental system, which closed European ports to British goods. Britain responded to this blockading European ports or shut off ports to keep people or supplies from moving in or out. France and Britain battled by seizing neutral ships suspected of trading with the other side, which eventually sparked the anger in the United States and triggered the War of 1812. All in all, Napoleon's continental system failed to bring Britain to its knees, even though their exports exponentially declined. Meanwhile, trade restrictions created goods to be scarce throughout Europe, and prices went through the roof, and intensified resentment against French power. In conclusion, the French Revolution consisted of many catastrophic events, and it shifted power throughout the nation and executed thousands of people in the course of 10 long years. It also caused economical, social, and political issues that caused distraught throughout the nation.